Tonight on Nation and Nation, federal housing advocate says growing numbers of Indigenous people are making up Canada's homeless population from coast to coast.
So there's a huge disproportionate representation of Indigenous folks experiencing homelessness in Canada.
Green Party co-leader Elizabeth Mace says the Canadian Nuclear Safety Agency did not meet its duty to consult obligations before approving a waste disposal facility near Ottawa.
It requires free, prior and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples on whose land this will be happening.
A Dalhousie University law professor says there are many positive things to be found in last week's Supreme Court decision on Canada's Indigenous Child Welfare Services law.
They accept that UNDRIP has application in Canada based on the UN Declaration Act, and that it's going to inform implementation moving forward.
Welcome to Nation and Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. As Canada continues to struggle with a homelessness crisis, tent cities have become commonplace in urban centres such as Montreal, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And these tent cities often contain large numbers of Indigenous people. Earlier this week, the Federal Housing Advocate released a report on tent cities with some recommendations on how the government should tackle the problem. Marie-Josée Hull joins me today from Cantley, Quebec. So welcome to the show, Ms. Hull.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so we have heard different reports about how much or how many Indigenous people make up these tent cities in the different urban centers, but how significant a number is it from your study?
Well, first of all, our study shows that probably about 20 to 25% of people experiencing homelessness are in encampments from coast to coast to coast to coast. And you mentioned the large urban centers, but I also met people in encampments in smaller places like Prince George and even Pine House in Métis settlements in northern Saskatchewan, as well as in Inuit communities in the big north. So it's not just an urban issue. We've got some stats on people who are Indigenous in encampments, especially going out west. Manitoba reports that in Winnipeg in 2018, 2/3 of people experiencing homelessness were Indigenous, and that number climbs to 94% in Thompson. In Saskatoon, an estimated 90% of people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous. In Edmonton, the figure is 60%, and in Prince George, it's 80%. So there's a huge disproportionate representation of Indigenous folks experiencing homelessness in Canada.
So extremely high, obviously, yeah. So I guess you did talk to a number of different stakeholders prior to filing your report, and what was it you heard from Indigenous stakeholders?
First and foremost, the home needs to be culturally appropriate, and that does fall under the definition of adequate housing. And as the federal housing advocate, whose responsibility is to hold governments to account on the responsibility for the right to adequate housing, this is something I'm very sensitized to. So, culturally appropriate means that people have the space in order to practice their culture. If people are in more northern regions, it's about having space for their trap lines or fishing and hunting gear. But it's also, being able to even smudge. Some places don't allow people to light anything in their homes, and they get evicted for it or they get threatened for it. So it's to have that Indigenous lens and to be able to properly provide the space for this. Another factor that I found, or another issue, is the common area in order to feast together. That's always lacking when we're thinking about culturally appropriate housing for Indigenous folks.
Now, one thing that I know you meet, of course, with individuals, you meet with stakeholder groups, lots of different people, lots of different Indigenous people and groups. Is there something that, one thing that we do hear back is that, that Indigenous people and groups don't feel engaged in the housing discussion at the higher levels of government or builders or whoever it may be. But is there something that you sort of heard in your travels that you think that government could do better in terms of engaging Indigenous people as part of tackling this problem?
Well, one of my big calls to action, is for the federal government to put together a national encampments response plan, because what we're seeing across the country is a patchwork of responses and an increasing number of court challenges. And we need the federal leadership on this. But then, and this plan needs to be created by August 31st. So the plan needs to have new resources. It needs to act immediately to save lives, including by making sure that people with lived experience of encampments have access to the basic necessities that they need to survive and live in dignity. We're calling for an end to forced evictions of encampments and put in place alternatives that are designed, here's the important part, following meaningful engagement with encampment residents. And then, there's a few other criteria, but also to respect human rights as well as Indigenous rights and prioritize permanent housing solutions. So I do want to circle back to the meaningful engagement. Forcing people into a situation never, ever works. But the voices of people of lived experience, especially Indigenous voices, are overlooked and ignored. They're not heard. And people are not appropriately engaged. But what does that mean? And properly engaging with people who are affected by government decisions is something that's a little bit new for governments. I'm going to give them a half pass on this, because to do proper engagement requires a lot of work and a lot of know-how and a lot of sensitivity, and it requires building relationships and building trust. And that takes time, especially when there's trauma involved, especially when there's a history of distrust, there's a history of violence, there's a history of I know best for you, and no one likes to be infantilized. So in order to get people to choose something different than encampments, then that meaningful engagement needs to happen. So careful to ensure that, my reports on Indigenous housing, specifically like the work we've done with Inuit housing, that the recommendations are co-created so that it's never a colonial approach, that it's never me who dare speak for Indigenous folks. I speak with Indigenous folks. And I think government needs to take a lead on how to find their own way to decolonize the approach of appropriately working with Indigenous people and finding the solutions that best meets their need. And quite often this also means ensuring that it's the Indigenous governments that make the decisions and have the access to the resources to do so.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much for the work you're doing. I think there's a lot of, as you know, talk about the affordability crisis of really buying a home, but maybe sometimes the people that most need shelter are kind of left out of this discussion. So thanks very much for doing this report and talking to us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
After the break, we'll talk to Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May about First Nations opposition to a proposed nuclear waste disposal facility just outside Ottawa. Welcome back. Earlier this year, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, gave the green light to build a nuclear waste disposal facility at Chalk River, about 180 kilometers northwest of Ottawa. But the fight against the facility is far from over. The proposed site will be on traditional Algonquin territory, and a number of area First Nations are opposed. This includes the Quebec First Nation in Quebec, filed a federal court application asking for judicial review of the CNSC decision. There was also a press conference and rally against the disposal facility on Parliament Hill on Wednesday. Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May was at the presser, and she joins me today in studio to talk about the issue. Welcome back to Nation, Ms. May.
Thank you, Fraser.
So proponents of this facility say it is for low-level radioactive waste, which won't necessarily put the public at risk. Why do you say this is not the case?
This is a question for me which is primarily about UNDRIP and whether the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the law of Canada now was respected. So the fact that the Quebec First Nations, that so many Algonquin Anishinaabe nations are part of this court action to challenge what the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission said. I mean, regardless of what the stuff is, and I'll speak to that question, Fraser, it requires free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples on whose land this will be happening. Now, we don't know exactly all the contents there because, as numerous groups have pointed out, I mean, Chalk River's been there since 1944. It was originally built around a nuclear weapons program for Canada, helping the U.S. In developing plutonium for nuclear weapons. All manner of radioactive waste could be in that mix. It is not, there's not like a list that you can look at and say, well, that's just a piece of clothing. We're not worried about that. The bottom line is we don't know, Canadian public, we don't know. Algonquin, Anishinaabe sovereignty nations don't know because the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has given a blanket approval based on what SNC-Lavalin, that owns the facility now, used to be AECL, but SNC-Lavalin, now renamed Atkins-Realis, owns it, wants to deal with this, and wants, rubber stamp approval to build what they call near surface disposal a kilometer from the Ottawa River. There are a lot of groups, individuals, experts, and of course, Indigenous peoples concerned. For me, I want to know what's in the so-called, what are they going to put in this so-called mound? And we know that there will be radioactive waste that can reach the environment.
Maybe we'll just go back to that for a second, because that's what the judicial application is about that they filed with the federal court, that duty to consult was not met. However, they have been meeting on this public meetings since 2016. So why would you say maybe that, I'm not asking you to speak in their words, but why might it have not been met for the process that's happened?
Well, it certainly, it came to the press conference today that it was pretty clear that what the AECL, now Atkins-Realis, SNC-Lavalin did, what the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission did, was assume they had a site, and that was the site they were going to go with. So there wasn't a preliminary consultation of where's a better place. And as Ole Hendrickson brought up, who's also part of the court action on behalf of Renfrew County Concerned Citizens and Sierra Club, they're saying, well, wait a minute, there's an earthquake fault involved here too. Where are we going to put this site? Wouldn't we rather look at, before choosing a site and saying that's it, have the consultations open, particularly about the site location, with the sovereign Indigenous nations of the area? That step was skipped in their haste to get it approved.
Okay, and then I thought I would go to now, you've had experience with this in types of court challenges to these types of facilities. Where do you think this, it's an application for a judicial review, but if it does get approved, where do you think this might go? I think
it's terribly important that, in this long journey of reconciliation, which is primarily the burden of reconciliation, is on the settler culture colonial powers that have created the racist system in which we at the moment seem to be trapped. The first question needs to be, if we say we believe in UNDRIP, where's the free, prior, and informed consent? For judicial review, I hope that the court looking at this will say, well, that's not acceptable. Canadian law says free, prior, and informed consent under UNDRIP, which is legislation, and the Section 35 of the Constitution is also really clear. Did the actions of the federal government meet the requirements under the law? That's the first question for the court in judicial review. And I'm really hoping and praying that the court comes down on the side of, if UNDRIP is going to mean anything, it has to be more than a piece of paper that isn't worth the paper it's printed on.
Do you think actually if it does get approved to go ahead that we could see something, groundbreaking perhaps in terms of including First Nations in these types of things that goes beyond maybe what CNSC or anybody was expecting?
I certainly hope so. At this point, we're the courts have made a huge difference. Let's face it, over and over and over again. How did we get to where we are now? We didn't start with just one case. It's Sparrow, and then it's Haida, and then it's Delgamuukw, and it's Chilcotin, and over and over and over again. The courts are pushing governments because they're saying, look, this is the law. This is what the Constitution says. This is what you did. You missed the mark. And you'd have to say at this point, the federal government represents a group of very slow learners. But the courts are pushing governments. And I hope that we can be educated as a society of colonial settler people to say, look, if you didn't actually get free prior, that's a key word, prior. You can't just say, this is a decision we've made. How do we arm wrestle you enough till you like it?
All right, well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there. But as always, thanks for joining us today in studio, Ms. May.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Up next, we'll have law professor Naomi Metallic, who will give her insights on the legal implications of last week's Supreme Court decision on Canada's Indigenous Welfare Services law. You're watching Nation to Nation, and I'm Fraser Needham. Last week, the Supreme Court of Canada announced a major decision on Bill C-92. That's a 2019 federal legislation that gives Indigenous communities control over welfare services that affect their children and families. The court upheld the law in the face of a constitutional challenge from Quebec that argued the legislation infringes upon its provincial jurisdiction. Joining me today to talk about the legal implications of the decision is Naomi Metallic, who is an associate professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. She joins me today from snowy Halifax. Welcome to Nation, Professor Metallic.
Great, thanks so much for having me, Fraser.
So, such a big decision last Friday when it came down. I know you're probably still sort of analyzing parts of it, but what would you say you liked about it in terms of what the decision was, and where do you think maybe the Supreme Court could have gone perhaps further?
So they definitely give a big green light to Parliament doing these types of things, working with First Nations in consultation to create legislation that can be a framework for self-government and national standards. So I think that's great. We want to see more of this, and we know that there's some stuff already in the hopper on this. There's legislation on water, on reserves. There's health legislation. There's supposed to be policing legislation. What's also good is they uphold the Act as a whole. You know that the Quebec Court of Appeal had said that the specific provisions that gave Indigenous laws that were created under coordination agreements, it said that the law provides that they can be paramount over provincial laws. And the Quebec Court of Appeal had said no, and they sort of suggested an alternate process. But the court said no, it's perfectly reasonable for the government to take that type of approach. So we could see more of that as well, which I think is excellent. It's another tool in the toolbox for this type of legislation. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good decision. The court decided it primarily on the basis of the federal jurisdiction under 9124, as opposed to deciding it under Section 35, saying that, you know, there's an inherent right to self-government that underscores the legislation. I mean, the government of Canada recognized that in the legislation and said this is the basis upon which we decided. But for reasons of, as they explain in it in the decision, exercising some judicial restraint and not going any further than they had to, they decided to keep it there. But with some important discussion about why they are, they're not saying there's no right to Section 35 under self-government under Section 35. In fact, they say, it's most likely, and they leave a lot of breadcrumbs to that decision, but they felt it was better for them to decide it on the basis of 9124. And there's a few people who were disappointed by that. Bruce McIver has written an article about that, and a few other people. But their reason was, well, sometimes if you answer some of these questions, you raise more questions. And so, for me, I think, there are questions that are still out there that could benefit from some more thinking and some scholarly writing and maybe development at the lower courts so that we have some good answers. Sometimes if they answer things too quickly or too soon, they might, we might get bad answers or bad, not great. So in some respects, it sort of lays the groundwork for, a future case finding Section 35, and it'll probably be in relation to child welfare. And then there's a lot of discussion about how most likely child welfare laws are upheld under Section 35. The last point I'll mention is UNDRIP. They accept that UNDRIP has application in Canada based on the UN Declaration Act, and that it's going to inform implementation moving forward, and it informs the implementation and development of Canadian law. So some really interesting stuff here.
I guess, how do you think now that the provinces will react to this decision? That's the real key thing, not just Quebec, but the provinces and territories.
Well, a lot of provinces have already sort of, accepted it, and some have even amended their child welfare laws in order to coordinate these three jurisdictions exercising at the same time, including, I think, BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. I don't have them all off the top of my head, but a lot are moving in this direction of recognizing that it's just now the norm that we have, three exercises of jurisdiction happening concurrently, and we can all work together on this. So, there is some stuff in there about, what's binding on the provinces, and there's a few sort of statements that are I'm still unpacking, trying to figure out. They suggest perhaps there's a little bit of wiggle room for the provinces around self-government, but I'm not sure what exactly they mean on that. And we know that Indigenous laws are going to be paramount over provincial laws when, they go through that coordination agreement process or try to for a year. So I'm still scratching my head a little bit on what that sort of one-off statement meant, but I'm sure there'll be more time to think about it and see where things go.
Now, of course, this law is not new. It's been around since 2019. And then, of course, we were just talking about Cindy Blackstock and her organization that, has really just been fighting for equal services for Indigenous children, and particularly in some cases First Nations. But I think that's the goal. That hasn't happened either on reserve or off. Do you think now that we can finally maybe move toward that, or do you still see some more hoops to jump through maybe?
Well, there is a non-compliance order that is currently ongoing under the tribunal. The tribunal still has jurisdiction, and long-term reform. We still don't have a sort of exactly clear picture on this. I believe the parties are working on that. But I think the hope, and I'm associated with the Caring Society, and we represented them in this case. But I think the hope is that there are things in here, the honor of the crown statements, and then that the government has to essentially walk the talk of recognizing self-government and what that means. And there's also reference to Jordan's principle directly in this decision. So I think there's things that are really helpful in here that will hopefully help in the conversations that are going to be happening at the CHRT. And there's also some decisions coming down the pike at the Supreme Court. There's one on First Nations funding for policing, Dominic, that is happening in April. And, we are trying to get before them as well to intervene again to sort of bring this message that, implementation funding is also necessary, and trying to say that it's part of the Crown honoring its obligations to First Nations and other Indigenous folks.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but thanks very much for joining us today, Professor Metallic. Very enlightening, and try to stay safe and out of the snowdrifts.
Thank you. Bye. Nemultis.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.